So, that's two Souls-likes in a row that I actually enjoy. Starting to lose some of my internet cred. Dark Souls sucks! Oh, okay. Okay, now that all that pressure's gone, I feel a lot better. I do, as always, want to discuss things in a particular order, but the behind the scenes of this game is honestly crazy, and I recommend you just look it up yourselves, because, well, this is a popular game, which means anything I can say about it has already been said 15 times before by people who are better, more dedicated, and generally smarter than I am. So, if you want to have an in-depth discussion of the lore of this game, please don't watch this video. Having said all that, I was actually very strongly considering not doing a video about this game. After all, I didn't do one for Elden Ring, which was a very deliberate and conscious choice. And in hindsight, I believe I absolutely made the correct choice for that one. But lots of people requested me to go ahead and do this one, so I'm going to try and summarize my thoughts as best as I possibly can. So I like to drop the bombshell early. You ready for this? This game has a great story and okay gameplay. There you go, there's your bombshell. Now you're probably thinking, or maybe you're thinking, or you might possibly be thinking, but whatever it is you're thinking, let me try to walk through this a little bit. Let me start by saying that this is absolutely a Souls-like. No question. I already mentioned that, but I want to be very clear about my opinion here. Because ignoring the obvious things like you die and you drop your souls and you can go recover it, and the fact that it's this bleak, horrible setting where you get two ending choices. I know there's actually 5 endings between being able to, keep things going the way they are, which is horrible and desperate, or you can decide to try and stop the cycle if you do the hard thing, or the idea of, the heavy emphasis on boss fights and the pseudo-Metroidvania nature of it, or maybe the focus on the fact that you're going through the ruins of a long-dead civilization, and it's a Souls-like, okay? There's nothing wrong with that. I also think this is more Souls-like than Metroidvania for reasons I'll get into in just a minute. But I do want to say that, as I mentioned earlier, the emphasis on boss fights not only is keenly felt throughout the course of the game, since the combat, the charms, and the boss fights themselves clearly form what I would say the most polished aspect of the gameplay, but also drag the score of the game up substantially, because otherwise I think this game would have scored even worse than it did. In fact, it might have actually, if you just somehow magically eject all those boss fight positives I gave, and there were several, I honestly think that the game would be net negative when it comes to the gameplay axis. And you're probably sitting there thinking, Lord, you're hyping me up too much. Okay. Let me walk you through this a little bit. Played the first day, and the first day I was just frustrated, irritable, irritated, not enjoying myself. But as always, it's not enough to just say that. I'm trying to figure out why. Because the answer wasn't because it was a bad game. In fact, I was enjoying the boss fights quite a bit, and there were several aspects of it that I was getting into, but the whole time I just felt annoyed. And I want to stress that word, annoyed. I was just kind of like, what's wrong with me? And that was actually the way I think of it, because that's the way I think in general. So I talked it over with a few friends of mine, and processed it a little bit, and several of them had played Hollow Knight, and really sat down and did a bit of an internal deep dive on what the hell was going on here. So I think it really boils down to 5 things, okay? Thing number 1, when it comes to a game like this, whether it's 3D or 2D, there's an overworld concept. It's not literally an overworld like in a Final Fantasy or whatever, but it does serve the same concept. It is the connective tissue in between the levels, right? One of the games I actually talked about this most extensively on was actually Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which very clearly has overworld segments, which are just designed differently, designed more about traversal and occasional exploration stuff and combat, as opposed to the actual levels of Soten, which are much tighter and much smaller, more condensed, and much more intense in terms of both combat and exploration. There's a clear delineation between the two. So the overworld in this case is not good, is the nicest way I think I could put that. It's entirely too busy for having a relative lack of density. And there's the connective tissues of traversing between levels, between areas, are just filled to the brim with mild and constant little irritations. You can't dash forwards because there's this one little ledge in your way. You can't drop down over here because there's a spike right beneath you. This enemy is always going to spawn over here, so they're always going to get in your path in that way, etc. And so it's not a big deal. It's not like it's like, oh my god, this is so... If it was a big deal, it would have been easier to identify what the hell was going on. But these tiny, tiny little micro irritations are constant. And so going from point A to point B is frustrating, right? Now hang on. That's point one. Point two, I should also probably mention that the map sucks, but I'll get to that in a minute. Point two is the game, the zones, the game in general is too big. I literally think that the zones could be shrunk down to at least a half, maybe 2/3 of their current size, and you wouldn't actually lose anything. Trimming the fat kind of a situation. So the reason this is relevant is because not only you're doing those little micro irritations, but there's more of them because there's more distance to traverse. So that's problem number 2. Problem number 3 is I don't enjoy going from point A to point B in this game. Now I know what you're thinking. You just said that. There's a concept we've talked about almost since the review series started, like 5 years ago at this point. Traversal mechanics is what I call it. The actual mechanical play style of getting from point A to point B. Grand Theft Auto 5 has fantastic car usage and car mechanics, and driving's very fun to do. In Just Cause, you have like the grapple hook, and you have all the different planes and different vehicles that you can use. In Spider-Man on the PS4, you've got the web swinging, which is fantastic. So forth and so on, right? It's the actual mechanic of movement and how fun that is. To use a specific example, which is a Metroidvania, Metroid Dread has absolutely amazing traversal mechanics and is one of the most fluid Metroidvanias I've ever played. So, that. Because while you do get a few kits, and it is awesome to do the Shine Spark, aka the Crystal Spark, there's just, like I said, there's too many places where you can't do it. There's very clearly, this is a Shine Spark area. And otherwise, all you're doing is jumping and running and dashing and jumping and running and dashing constantly, which is just not fun. That leads us up to point 4. Point 4 is the if you're paying, the reason I'm going down this list, by the way, this is something I talk about a lot. Interlocking gameplay mechanisms can make a game much better. Resident Evil 4, right? If you have good encounter design, good enemy design, good gun design kit, in short, good level design, and good itemization, then what you have is awesome. But if any one of those things are missing, the whole work is diminished for it. It amplifies the other aspects of game design, but that can work in a negative as well, and that's my point. The irritations in the way, I probably could have gotten by those if, for example, it was much more fun to go from point A to point B. Like in, here's another example. Shantae and the Pirate's Curse is a game where traversal mechanics were just fun to go from point A to point B. I keep saying that, I'm sorry. I'm still fighting a headache right now, and probably because of the tooth thing. It's okay, I'm seeing the dentist Monday, so hopefully that'll fix that whole thing. And so, you know, it might have been able to ignore the annoyance if it was funner to move from point A to B. The size of the areas might have been, you know, something I could at least tolerate if it wasn't really bothersome to traverse in general. So each one of these points is something that could have been solved by the other point, but instead the other points are making it worse, which is my overall mentality here. Because then we have the final point, which is the fast travel spots, the stagways. Now, there's actually a mod out there which lets you warp between benches, which ironically by itself would probably fix that problem, and indeed most of these problems. Because there are fast travels, they are very far spread out, and frankly not very well positioned. There's a lot of irritation, and like at several points I'm like, I have to get to there. And I just would stall because I couldn't even think of the closest place to there. I'm just like, I guess I'll go here and then spend 10 minutes of my life getting there. Which, of course, runs into the other problems, because if there was a whole bunch of fast travel spots, like each bench, then a lot of these other problems could be bypassed. And you see why I'm including all of these little problems in one cohesive bundle here, because all of this makes the level design not very good, especially from a platforming perspective. Now, I should probably mention that there's several aspects of the level design that are excellent. There are individual jumping challenges or rooms that are awesome. I loved going through the palace and the infinite blade spines of Doom. I actually really enjoyed several aspects of Deep Nest, etc., etc. But the connective tissue and the overworld, substantially more lacking. All this runs into our final problem, and I kind of already have hinted at this. The game has a very bad seconds and minutes problem. Now, some of the things I just talked about are aspects of the seconds and minutes problem. I should probably define that, because people keep asking me to define everything. If you ever wonder, I'm not trying to treat you like you're stupid or anything. Yeah, that's not the mentality. I have been asked many times to not assume people have seen every other thing I've ever covered, so to try and explain my definitions as we're going. Seconds and minutes is when something that would take a minute actually takes like a minute and 20 or a minute and 5 or a minute and 3, because there's just one little extra time waster in the middle of that. It's extremely common in game design, both intentionally and not. Usually to pad out the game, to make the game seem longer, which is a thing that goes back at least to the NES era that I'm aware of. So, those extra little unnecessary flourishes, or the animations when you're picking something up, all that kind of stuff leads to seconds and minutes. And there's a lot of that in this game, moments where you just have to kind of wait, or something takes an extra second, or you have to hop on the bench in order to be able to change your charms, or update the map, and pulling up the map, even the quick map thing, actually takes a solid second to pull it up, ignoring the fact that it doesn't pause the game, which, I could live with that if it popped up immediately, or gave me a mini-map or something, but instead it's just, hang on. And there's just all kinds of things which make the whole game much longer than it should be. By the end of the game, 4 days, I was playing through this game, it was about a 30-hour game, I was honestly kind of sick of it. Now, I have to mentally remove myself from that when it comes to the review, because I'm sick of this game is not a valid negative. But the reasons why I'm sick of the game, I feel, are valid negatives and things that need to be acknowledged and addressed. Frankly, all of this is just another example of the whole first game thing I was already talking about. It's very clear that there's some great and inventive ideas here, and some fantastic concepts and storytelling, as well as some excellent boss fights. Battle Sisters. But at the same time, it feels like they had trouble either pushing it together or were still just learning things, because after all, this is a really small dev team, which I'm mentioning now to make sure that nobody in the comments thinks I don't know that. And, they had a bit of a production cycle thing. I will say I'm looking forward to Silksong, because generally speaking, expansion effect takes place with a sequel, so, I'm hoping for that. Anyways, I have other complaints. The fact that you have to go back to the bench, I just mentioned that's ridiculous. The game has really bad audio spam. Like, I actually wanted to stop doing the Grim side quest because I was so sick of hearing every few seconds. Just the audio onslaught was a little bit ridiculous in several circumstances. The side quests were kind of irritating. There are a couple of bosses that suck. Excuse me. The map itself isn't really what I would call a good map. And that's actually about it, because everything else was pretty awesome. Like I mentioned earlier, the boss fights are definitely the hallmark, and I do love the charms as a concept. I feel like if the charms had a polishing pass on how much they cost, because I do think some are overpriced, and I think some are underpriced, and I do think that if you could just swap charms on the fly, then this would be a much, much, much more interesting builds gameplay system. Because there are builds here. There's several different ways. I had like 3 or 4 presets I kept mentally cycling through. By the way, loadouts, that would be another awesome thing for something like this. But because you can't swap on the fly, well, as soon as I got the Mark Recall thing, I started getting into a habit of getting up to the boss, throwing down a mark, save and quitting back to the bench, changing my build, reloading the mark, and you'll notice all of this is the seconds and minutes problem I said. Instead of just going into menu and changing my build, I had to pause, then go back, and then do the thing, and start over, load the save, load up the game, go to the bench, swap my things, listen to someone going up top for me because audio spam is ridiculous, and go through this whole process just to change my build. And the reason I never really processed this as well as I did until this particular playthrough. For those of you who don't remember, Code Vein, the game we just covered, allows you to just swap builds as long as you're out of combat. Actually, I think you can do it in combat. But the point is you can just swap between builds pretty much like that. That game also needs a loadout feature, by the way. But that was so amazing because for the developers, it allowed them to change up their bosses. They could have bosses that are very specific to X, Y, or Z build, building in very specific weaknesses and strengths because they have a greater chance of knowing that the player is going to be able to adapt to that, to re-tactically change their situation, to try and move through it. And of course, for the player, it's obvious what it offers. It allows you to try out different playstyles to see what you like, and to see what you enjoy, and to see what works and what doesn't. There are several bosses in this very game that were made, I don't want to say trivialized, but were made... I'm going to say that they were clearly designed for specific builds and specific charms, and once you put them on, the fight just coheses, and it's like, that's what the fight should be. And if you don't, well, it sucks to be you. You could argue you don't have to, and that's true, but the fact that that option isn't there is somewhat aggravating. Now, the irony is, of course, you're probably expecting me now to spend some time talking about how the gameplay is good. The problem is, if I just say bosses, I've kind of done my job here. There's a lot of very inventive, creative, awesome boss design. You're probably wondering what my favorite boss is, to which I ask you, what's your favorite boss? Of all the bosses throughout the game, which one sung with you the most? And there's several that worked for me. I'm actually debating it even as of this very second, which boss was probably the best boss fight for me. Because the Manus Lords were just really, really, really good. But I think as I'm debating this here in my head, I think I'm actually going to go with the first Grim fight. The second Grim fight's nice, but the first Grim fight is legit. I think I'm going to put a pin in that as my favorite boss fight. Like a very, very awesome fight. Loved it. Lots of different movements, lots of different ways you can avoid and attack while avoiding. He actually has the closest thing to a health bar that this game has because it's like phase transitions you can see. Which, by the way, can we just have health bars? I know there's a health bar mod. Can we just add health bars? Dark Souls has had health bars since Dark Souls. Can we just... So, other than that, I think that's all I'm going to say about the gameplay for right now. So I suppose you want me now to talk about the story. So as usual, spoilers. I'll go and give the 3. 3, 2, 1. It was all the Radiant Snow. So you're probably wondering why this story scored so damned well. Well, I spent a lot of time talking about how I feel the gameplay was lacking, but I think that in addition to the whole first game thing and figuring out what they were doing thing, I think there's a very big reason why the Overworld design is so bad. It's because it's not designed from a gameplay perspective, but a story one. They didn't think about how it would feel or play to go through it. They thought about how it would look, because what they're doing is they're painting a picture. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, a picture tells 1,000 words, blah, 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 but it's very true. One image can say so much. I actually have a whole category for it. I refer to it as visual storytelling. This game got, I think, something like 12 visual storytelling positives, which is, I think, a new record, consequently, because there's so much to it. The mines and the victims there, and the way that they clearly pulled from that as well. The mines connect into the crossroads, which lead down into the west part of the City of Tears, which is so clearly where the poor people live, as opposed to the east City of Tears, where all the rich people live, and they dine on the flukes, which are down below, which there's kind of a self-sustaining resource, and it makes sense for bugs in general, and just, there are so many connecting threads, and so many background elements, and so many bits of here's an image that tells a story. A lot of video games, especially in the last, I want to say about 10 years, have fallen into the trap of thinking that the background, the visuals of an area are just there to add some kind of framework. In other words, you're going through a ruined city, so you see a ruined city. But a truly great game, a game that really knows what it's doing, will say, well, hang on. What do we want to do with this ruined city? What do we want to showcase? Do we want to emphasize that maybe these people fought to the bitter end against, I don't know, the giant fluke monsters that were charging in? So maybe you could have some flukes, just fluke corpses scattered around, or maybe long since desiccated husks, but you're not sure what they are, and there's a couple of bones. And some of those bones are actually still gripping weapons, and they're kind of trapped under the rubble, or maybe one of them actually killed themselves or whatever. There's things you can do with the specifics and the details of that ruined city to paint a picture, to tell a story. And that right there is what this game does better than anything else. All the other aspects of both story and gameplay pale, no pun intended, in comparison to how much this game shows you constantly. Picture any of the zones in your mind really quick. Picture the transition between the crossroads and the green, or the green down to the fungus, or the fungus down to the deep nest. Picture the deep nest as you go through and it's loud and all the centipedes, but then you go further west and the webs start showing up and it gets quieter and there's more and more webs and you see skittering in the background. Or maybe you get further down into the depths of the old realm and all of a sudden the music just stops and there's this weird echo and you can see bits and pieces of what used to be machinery that carried things to and from here, which is now broken down after years of either misuse or deliberate sabotage in order to chop this off from the rest of the world. The remains of the palace, or the descent into the abyss, and the gigantic millions deep mound of corpses, which is the level design. There is so much that this game does to show you and tell you its story, and I love it. But I did promise I'd share a few theories, blind, wild, stupid theories, that'll be proven wrong by anybody who has any experience with this game whatsoever. And, of course, Silksong would probably prove me wrong on everything. But let's talk about what's going on here. The first and most obvious thing is even though the Pale King, who I may occasionally refer to as the Worm without meaning to, so the Worm, insists that there's nothing beyond this realm, that it's all the wastes. So I don't buy that on any level, ignoring the fact that there are a few individual hints that there are people from outside that got here, including the Worm himself. There's also the fact that it feels more, it makes more sense to me, especially considering the scale we're talking about here with regards to this entire, bug universe, that what they're probably in, is in the middle of a desert or something, or a wasteland. There are plenty of places like that. And it could indeed be a long ways for a bug to get to the nearest bit of civilization, but it doesn't mean it's not there, right? And yes, I know Silksong shows like a kingdom and blah, blah, blah. Let's ignore that for just a moment. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention because I think it's the most important starting point to emphasize the idea of what the outside world does in relation to this place. Now, this is going to be the weird one and the thing that is almost assuredly going to be proven wrong by Silksong or very right by Silksong. I think the worm, or possibly the worms, there's a lot of malleability on this, go around giving creatures sentience and sapience. That's the big one. I should have probably built up to that, but, whatever. Because there's a lot of implication that the bugs were just bugs. Nothing else, like we'd see in real life. They just run around and they kill each other and each other. There's no life, there's no culture, there's no little cabinets filled with curios or thoughts of currency or civilization or love or anything that comes along with it. They were just bugs. Then the worm comes along. And this also kind of ties into another idea, the idea of the masks. It is entirely possible the worm, in taking on the mask of the Pale King and offering these masks to the bugs, that the mask itself, shall we say, enforced an identity upon the individuals, thus granting them the concept of individuality and sentience and sapience, and developing into a culture, a civilization, multiple civilizations, actually, if you want to think about it. So the thing is, you might, if you rewind a moment, our first question that comes up here is, why? It could be that this is just what the worm does. It could be this is just what the worms do. But one of the other things I find interesting is it's entirely possible that the Pale King just was doing this because maybe this area was unique in the fact that they were all just bugs. One of the things that we see several times is that those who are infected with the infection don't really think in the traditional sense of the word. They slowly descend into babble. Their ability to communicate slowly goes away. Their ability to perform complex tasks slowly goes away. And bit by bit, they just kind of turn into mindless husks and zombies. Or bugs. What if the original rule of this land, which was governed over by the Radiants, was just everyone must be a bug? And what if that's abnormal? What if that's the unusual part? And the worm showed up to fix that, to usurp the evil queen, which was forcing all these individuals to live as mere bugs, to free them in such a manner. It's a little too liberating for me, but it's kind of interesting to think about how that could make sense. It would also go a long way to explaining how other kingdoms have sentient sapient bugs without the worm being involved in that. It's also possible that others other than the worm could do that. So let me rewind a second. I keep referring to the worm, of course. But there's the whole class of higher beings, right? All of the so-called higher beings. They claim divinity and a whole bunch of other things, but none of that really matters because what I want to talk about is what makes them higher beings. Several settings, and of course I can't think of any right now, have this concept where there's a mage, and there's all kinds of mages, hundreds of mages, thousands of mages. But then there's the special class. They directly tap into the weave, or they directly draw from the dream, or whatever, right? And they're not mages in the strictest sense of the word. They're a class above that. Planeswalkers, to use the Magic the Gathering concept. What if the higher beings are that, dreamwalkers, in short? So everyone can dream, obviously, within the setting, at least everyone we know about. But what if the dreamwalkers have the ability to actually manipulate, use, maintain their sense of selves, and alter within the dream, rather than simply being at the whims thereof? That offers a lot of possibilities, and is my personal theory on how the dream works. Because, if you look at it, the Radiance is the most obvious example of dream manipulation. That's how the plague and the infection spread. That's how she directly controls and manipulates several puppets, including several bosses who all scream with her voice, up to and including the Hollow Knight. But if you think about it from that perspective, it would explain how the Pale King could have either gifted or reinvigorated the individuality, the sentience and sapience within the denizens of this area, by infiltrating their dreams and allowing that to flow forwards. We also know that several other of the higher beings have some dream manipulation capacity here as well. They just don't do much with it, probably because they just aren't as interested or invested in doing anything with it. In fact, other than the Pale King and the Radiance, who are very clearly against each other, most of the other higher beings are just here. Doesn't really seem to care about anything. And we know almost nothing whatsoever about the Nightmare. And we know literally nothing whatsoever about whatever the blue one is. They're all color-coded too, which is helpful. We've got amber for the Radiance, the kind of pale light for the Pale King. We've got blue for I have no idea. We've got red for the Nightmare Heart. And then we've got green for and I believe that's all of them. And that's cool, by the way. Good way to do that. It kind of shows their particular influence and manipulation, how they are affecting the dream. Color coding is always helpful when it comes to visual storytelling like this, so you can tell a story without words. Obviously, there are words in this game. I'm not trying to say there aren't, but you get my point. So, Radiance, and then, of course, naturally, the Pale King, either because screw her, or because, she needs to go away, or because this needs to not happen again, whatever the reasoning, whatever the motive is, the worm decides to go ahead and smack down the Radiance, pushing her back into the dream and preventing her from manifesting by erasing everyone's memory of her, which makes sense if higher beings are directly connected to said dream, as I just postulated. If a higher being needs to be dreamed, to be remembered, to be a part of existence in order to exist, see Forgotten Realms deities for a good example of this kind of concept, then it would make sense that that would be how you would push one away in order to try and erase it from existence, in order to defeat your enemy, so to speak. But if you're paying any kind of attention, you're probably thinking, Lore, hang on, there's one higher being you didn't actually mention. One color I didn't mention. That would be the color of black. The Abyss. So, that's an interesting one. Because, based on a few very minor tidbits, and the way it acts and reacts, and the nature of the Pale King's plan, I think the Abyss didn't, emphasis on past tense, have a higher being at all. I think the Abyss was, let's go ahead and just call it completely neutral. It was, I don't even have a real-life example of this, really. It was a rock. There's no sentience, there's no intent, there's no perspective. It's just there. Someone else can come and use that rock for something else, but the rock itself is just a rock. And that's how the Abyss seems to be portrayed. The Pale King tapped into the Abyss and used this neutral power in order to craft his vessels. Many many vessels in order to try and seal away the radiance. Which brings up an interesting question. Why didn't he just fight her directly? In fact, there's an even more interesting question immediately after that. Where'd the Pale King go? Where is the worm? He's obviously not gone, because after all, people remember him. People still talk about him. His symbol is everywhere. We literally go to his corpse, his original corpse. So, now, this is where I'm going to go and complain about one thing about the story I don't like, and it's the vagueness. I know, but hear me out for a second. I do think vagueness serves its point and purpose in storytelling. I do. In fact, I myself tend to automatically build some degree of vagueness into my storytelling to make sure that the audience has the chance to make up their own mind about what they're seeing. That's cool. I'm with that. What I'm not with is too much vagueness. It's a gradient, right? There's plenty of information, and there's no information whatsoever, and there's a whole gradient in between here. And there are a few specific facts which we have so little information on that I feel it's not even worth speculating on because it's effectively just a blank sheet of paper. Very hopeful that Silksong will fill in some of these gaps, consequently. But anyway, so we've got the Abyss, neutral power. It's drawn from, and, well, one of the things that the tree says, which I disagree with completely, is that we can go replace the existing Hollow Knight as a vessel. But there are several elements throughout the game which, I'm going to say this as clearly as I can, are very Gordon Freeman. Okay, maybe I could say it a little bit more clearly. The game clearly wants you to decide on the personality and perspective of your character, the knight, the ghost, whatever you want to call them. There's several things you can do in different ways, which actually garner different responses from different NPCs. There's side quests you can do. You can help certain people out, saving the grub, doing the flower, etc. All that stuff you can do, and that tangibly and in a lore way affects the personality of your character. Why is this relevant? One of the ways that the vessel was supposed to work was it was supposed to be, for all intents and purposes, a completely empty vessel. A chunk of void and abyss, which could then contain the radiance, the end. And because there was nothing there to dream, nothing there to think, nothing to feel, no personality, no individuality, the radiance couldn't actually influence it. She tells us that we could go replace the Hollow Knight, but I absolutely don't think that's true, because I think we're too much of a person, especially by the end of the game. How much we are at the beginning of the game, debatable. By the end? I mean, we're getting fan fiction written about us, for God's sakes. So, that doesn't leave many options there. The only option, then, is to kill it, which, well, if you think about it for just a second, if you decide to go and do that, and you are the strongest single manifestation of void in the area, what if we have actually become the higher being of the void? By virtue of having grown, imprinted a sentience onto an otherwise empty force. The rock now actually has a mind and a will, and now it wants to do things. This is pretty clearly shown, in my opinion, in two of the 5 endings, where the way in which we interact at the end and allow the void to completely, absolutely Shrek the radiance and actually destroy her within dream state, by the way, so we destroy her in the dream, she's gone. That makes me think, and that could have a lot of possibilities, good and bad, for the future. After all, most of the higher beings are at least neutral and generally beneficial. The Radiance was one of the only ones who didn't work that way. And even in the Radiance's case, you could argue she was just trying to survive. Don't fully agree with that, but it is something that could be argued. Unfortunately, all this is a whole lot of who knows where this is going to go. But I guess I actually don't have much else to add about that. I could talk about a few other things. One of the games I wanted to compare this to is Ori and the Blind Forest, which I kind of forgot to. But this game, I do want to mention that this game and Ori and the Blind Forest are very similar, even on a story axis, because both games aren't that good on the gameplay side, but are very good on the story side, and it's very clear that's what they were going for. And I feel like this game does a whole lot with its narrative, and Ori does a whole lot with the narrative. Ori is far more platformer focused, whereas this one is far more combat focused. I mean, name a boss in Ori and the Blind Forest that isn't actually just a platforming challenge, for example. By contrast, name a solid platforming section within this game. There's a couple, Just like there's a couple bosses over in the other game, but you get my point. Anyways, this has been an enjoyable experience. I do wish the game was a little bit shorter, but that's okay. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts, pathetic and terrible as they are. I'm looking forward to hearing your theories, thoughts, comments, and corrections. I'll see you next time.